It is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer here. We got a lot to discuss. Mere days after the Ravens season comes to a disappointing conclusion against the Kansas City Chiefs in a 17-10 loss in the AFC Championship. On this episode, though, we're going to look forward. We're going to look ahead to this offseason and see what we have in front of this Baltimore Ravens team. We'll give our final thoughts on that unfortunate AFC Championship game loss. And we'll look ahead to maybe some coaching news that could be on the horizon. All that and more coming up. But first, a quick word from our sponsors.
If you have an appetite for saving money, then you should get the Rofo Rewards app from Royal Farms. Use the Rofo Rewards app to place mobile orders for pickup or delivery and earn royalty points to redeem for free stuff. And right now, new Rofo Rewards members will get a free any-size coffee for signing up. You can download the Rofo Rewards app at the Apple App Store or Google Play today. You'll find it's a very appealing app to have. Real fresh, real fast. Royal Farms.
The CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament is February 26th through March 3rd at CFG Bank Arena. Baltimore is bringing the hoops, the culture, and the energy. So grab your tickets now and book your hotel at baltimore.org/CIAA.
All right, Jonas, it's been 2 days now. We were in the Ravens locker room for their clean out on Monday. A very sad scene, but also a very empty locker room. Not a lot of players were there to talk to the media. We did get some comments from guys like Kyle Hamilton and Patrick Queen and Zay Flowers, but just seemed like a shell-shocked group that was not expecting to be cleaning out their lockers at this point in the season.
Yeah, that was the theme. That was what everybody said. You do enough of these, Paul, and I know that was that your first postseason locker room cleanup for an NFL team?
That I actually went to the locker room cleanup back in, 2018? Back when the Ravens lost, they ended their season that lost to the Bengals on New Year's. And when they just needed to beat the Bengals and to secure a spot in the playoffs. That was a very different looking Ravens locker room. It has been remodeled since then, but that was arguably a more shell-shocked locker room at that point than it was yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to say that a team gets used to losses like this because I think each time that the pain is fresh, but the sentiments do kind of run together. I think the big distinction between this year and last year is last year, the big question on everybody's mind was, will Lamar be back? And there was a lot of folks in that locker room basically beseeching the Ravens front office, Eric DeCosta, John Harbaugh, Steve Bisciotti, to do whatever it took to get Lamar back because he was a pending free agent then. There was the standoff with the team. There was the whole matter of him not showing up for the playoffs. And now he's under contract. He's going to be the MVP. And it's not, will he be back? It's like, can he help get us back to the AFC Championship game? Can he get us to a Super Bowl? We didn't talk to Lamar yesterday. He's usually a no-show for these locker room cleanouts. Like you said, a lot of players are. So it is what it is. But, everyone said the right thing. No one pointed fingers. Everyone talked about how much fun they had, how great the staff was, how good the vibes were, how disappointing it was to have this be the Monday that your season ends on. But, so much of what's said on a locker room cleanout Monday, like yesterday, is, it kind of falls apart pretty quickly once free agency starts. I mean, these guys will inevitably go pick the team that's offering them most money. They'll end up not in Baltimore because the Ravens decide we would rather spend our money elsewhere. And, there's just not a lot you can say on a day like this that really will matter in 2 months' time, 6 months' time. It's just a matter of just trying to fit together the puzzle pieces of what happened and just honestly do a reckoning. It's a little bit of therapy, I think, for the players as much as it is for exactly what.
Yeah, we'll get into in a little bit just how many pending free agents this Ravens team has. But, I mean, Patrick Queen is on that list. Geno Stone is on that list. Both of those guys spoke yesterday. And, both indicated they'd like to be back, but it's often not up to the player. It's often up to,
and everyone says that, to be honest.
yeah, exactly. So it's a two-way street, and the player has to do what's best for him, and he can't just let loyalty, allow him to sign a deal that doesn't make sense for him. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But Jonas, I went back and rewatched painfully that 17-10 loss to the Chiefs. So many things, so many issues that cropped up along the second watch, because it just felt like in real time the team could not get anything going offensively. And certainly watching that game back, that narrative was confirmed watching that. A lot of wasted possessions. I believe that was your word of the day. And just a lot of plays that you wish that the Ravens likely wish they had back. I saw a lot of comments on Twitter, on social media, about whether Lamar Jackson had nearly enough time to throw the ball, whether he was getting open receivers downfield. There were just a lot of missed plays, a lot of missed opportunities by Lamar Jackson. This loss was not entirely on him, but some plays that I forgot about. Him taking that sack when they're down 17-7 in the third quarter, 3rd and 9 from the Kansas City 41, safety blitz. Lamar takes an 8-yard sack there, which gets them out of field goal range. It would have been a very long field goal had it been an incomplete pass. But if they pick up some yards, it would have been a manageable 4th down that they could have gone for. Or, they could have tried a 55 to shorter yard field goal if they had just picked up, a chunk handful of yards there. And plays like that just killed opportunities for the Ravens. The Zay Flowers fumble was big, I know, but they had so many scoring opportunities that they just let slip that just cannot be explained away.
Yeah, we tend to focus on what happened last, on what was most painful, but that was the play you're mentioning was a huge one. Zay Flowers is coming open on a crosser, a post over the middle. Isaiah Likely is running into space. He's a check down option on a crosser. If Lamar sees him, if Lamar hits him, that's probably a first down, and then they move the chains, or at the very least get into field goal position. But you got to do your 111th, and on that one, it was not so much Lamar's fault as it was Justice Hill's. It was the team's most trusted pass blocking running back just completely whiffing on a block on Justin Reed. And Justin Reed's the guy who strings him down and takes him for a sack. And, that's 3 points off the board. It was just so many of those little things that added up. And I know we want to talk about the Isaiah Likely, the Isaiah Likely miss and the Zay Flowers fumble, but there were just plays all over this game where if the Ravens do one thing, not just on offense, but on defense as well, maybe you build up enough of those small victories that you nickel and dime this Chiefs team enough where you can get to that finish line and you don't have to worry about this game ending 17-10.
What was your thoughts on that final play, by the way? This loss was by no means on the defense, but there were some defensive miscues, and certainly the defense had a chance at the end to give Lamar Jackson one more shot at trying to tie that game or potentially take the lead if they had gotten the touchdown and 2-point conversion. But Arthur Mollett getting beat by Marquez Valdez-Scantling. What was your thought in rewatching that play? What do you think happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. It looked like the Ravens expected the Chiefs to throw short, to throw intermediate. That was a 3rd and long play. So you have Arthur Mollett in the slot there, is playing outside leverage against MVS, who obviously has the speed advantage there, wants to force everything into the middle where the Ravens have a couple guys dropping. And he was probably like the last progression for Mahomes, because he's looking for guys, to get open, maybe expecting a blitz. The Ravens did not blitz anybody. I know some fans took umbrage at that. You want to heat Mahomes up, but that there are not a lot of guys that I would want to blitz less than Patrick Mahomes just over the course of his career. So, Marcus Williams is kind of guarding the first down marker. Kyle Hamilton is dropping into coverage, trying to pick up any crossers. And, it was a really nice pass rush by Michael Pierce. He gets into Mahomes' grill just as he's letting that thing go. But MVS has a step on Mollett. There's a perfect throw. Mollett can't turn his head because of how far he is away from MVS, and MVS has to kind of turn back and make a tougher than expected catch. He kind of had to veer out of his route running lane, but he did what he had to. He caught the ball. I think I saw this morning, Ball, that this is the first game all season that the Chiefs didn't have a drop pass. I'm sure the Ravens would have loved to have that first drive happen on that one, because if they do, they have a small ray of hope, but it was just not to be.
Yeah, and in terms of the rushing attack and the lack thereof, I should say, that is what has drawn the majority of the criticism, I think, from the outside, especially because the final stats do not flatter Todd Monken at all. The fact that they only had, 8 handoffs to running backs, the fact that they did not use Lamar Jackson's legs nearly enough. And you actually found an interesting stat about just how infrequently they relied upon the run in this game.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go with counting stats, just 11 designed runs. So you take away the scrambles, that's 10 fewer than they had in that 2019 loss to the Titans, where Greg Roman came under fire for just how pass happy he became. But in this one, 568 NFL games have been played this year. That includes the regular season. That includes the postseason. The Ravens' design run rate ranked 563rd, under 20%. And for that to happen in a game where you were never more than 10 points down, pretty unacceptable, pretty disappointing. We won't talk to Todd Monken, I'm sure, until maybe the draft. That's just how these things go. We'll probably talk to John Harbaugh pretty soon, whether it's this week, next week, a couple weeks from now, as he kind of finalizes what this 2024 staff is going to look like. But this was a run-first team. This not a run-first team. This was a very qualified rushing team. Lamar obviously took power over how this offense wanted to run. Maybe it was his choice partly to be as pass happy as they were, but at some point you got to rein someone in and tell them, hey, this is not a very good Chiefs run defense. They are missing a starting defensive tackle. They're missing a starting off-ball linebacker. They are banged up in the secondary. We got to take our chances with, giving the ball to Gus Bus, giving the ball to Justice Hill, maybe even giving the ball to Dalvin Cook, and just letting, keep doing what we can to keep this very, very creative, aggressive Chiefs blitzing attack at bay, because the best way to stop a defense from running is to have them exposed with blitzes that don't fit the run gaps, the way you want to. But the Ravens just did not take that option.
It seemed like the first possession after halftime, in rewatching that game, they went with back-to-back runs. They had Gus Edwards run up the middle. Then they did a jet sweep run for Zay Flowers. Those 2 runs totaled 4 yards. And then Lamar Jackson has an incomplete pass. And it just felt like, which was a flawed decision, it felt like that was the moment they decided to abandon the run completely. And I know you have to give Zay Flowers the ball on those jet sweeps sometimes in order to keep the defense honest, because of just how often you have him running motion, and you have to keep the defense accounting for that. But that just felt like 2 bad runs, and then they say, all right, that's it. Let's stop trying with the rushing attack. It's very frustrating that it came down to that.
The oddity on that jet sweep, obviously you don't want to make too much of this, but like you're looking at the next gen stats data for that one, I think the expected yards for that run was like 10 yards, and they ended up at 2. And I don't know if that was because maybe the expectation was that Gus Edwards, in the same way that you can kind of have tight ends arc block, which is like basically skirting that first level defender to get to the second level, but he takes that first guy that he sees, and that leads the safety to come in and clean up on Zay, and Zay's not able to make him miss. But
yeah,
if they were able to get past that first guy and get to that second level, Rashad Bateman was doing his thing. There wasn't a whole lot of company on that right side of the field for Zay, but it just wasn't to be.
All right, let's turn the page. Let's focus on the future now. Let's talk about what the Ravens have in front of them this offseason. Jonas, you touched on it off the top. This is a much different offseason than the offseason the Ravens faced last year. And for that, I think they're grateful, because at this point last year, we were asking players, we were asking front office members and John Harbaugh how much they wanted Lamar Jackson back, how much they wanted that contract extension to get done. The fact that they don't have that giant anvil hanging over them is massive, just because you have your franchise quarterback in tow for years to come. However, they do have quite a lot of pieces around him that they have to worry about. Just some of the free agents that will be hitting the open market this offseason. OBJ, Nelson Aguilar, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Tyler Huntley, John Simpson, Kevin Zeitler, Justin Madubuike, Brent Urban, Jadeveon Clowney, Kyle Van Noy, Patrick Queen, Ronald Darby, Arthur Millette, Geno Stone. The list goes on and on, Jonas. This is, you wrote about on the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months, about that being the number one priority for the Ravens right now is not necessarily how many of those guys they can bring back, but just figuring out how all those guys, a stay or go situation with all those guys, and how they can fit as many of them as they can under a salary cap that is now being, eaten up by Lamar Jackson's contract.
It's not going to be easy. This is where you just trust in your drafting ability. You trust in the guys that you have on the roster as youngsters. You trust in the ability of the coaching staff, which might be a very, very different coaching staff when we reconvene next week or 2 weeks from now. This is the reality of the NFL. You can write this same kind of offseason story basically anytime a season ends, because this is not a sport where guys stick around for very long. Most contracts are 1, 2, maybe 3 years. It's very rarely do you sign for longer than a couple of years. And those guys are the superstars who you trust to come back. Those are the Roquan Smiths, those are the Lamar Jacksons. But there was always going to be attrition. There was always going to be massive departures. You just hope that the guys who are leaving aren't huge contributors, but unfortunately for the Ravens, they are. You have a guy who finished second in the NFL in interceptions in Geno Stone. You have a guy who was, top 10 in the NFL and ESPN's pass rush win rate in Kyle Van in Jadeveon Clowney. You have a Pro Bowler in Patrick Queen. You have another Pro Bowler in Kevin Zeitler. Congrats to Kevin, named this morning as a replacement for Joe Thuney. You have one of the NFL's most successful red zone runners in Gus Edwards. You have a team leader in OBJ. You have another team leader in Nelson Aguilar. Millette, Darby, guys who are just so reliable, so trustworthy in this defensive scheme, and again, a scheme that might be coordinated by someone else next year, depending on how Mike McDonald's interviews go in Washington and Seattle. So this is just a thing that can kind of compound. It's not just the free agents that you're losing, but it's how they fit in a scheme that might be changing as well, with a different leadership, with a different emphases. So it's never easy. This is the kind of contract you enter into. If you are Eric DeCosta, you are paying for the most important position on the field, but you're paying a hefty sum for it. And it's just a matter of how many other force multipliers do you have, and how much can Lamar Jackson do to lift the ceiling and lift the floor of this offense.
Russell Street Report says the Ravens are projected to have $16 million in cap space going forward, but that's before you factor in the rookie class. That's before you factor in the practice squad, and maybe leaving some room for some in-season additions. And how can they clear some more space? That's the second big question that is facing the Ravens right now, because if you do want to bring back guys like Justin Madubuike and Geno Stone and maybe Jadeveon Clowney, you may have to restructure some contracts. You brought up in that article, Jonas, the likelihood that they are probably going to release Tyus Bowser, who spent the entire season on the non-football injury list, so they could save $5.5 million there. They would incur a massive dead cap hit if they were to release Ronnie Stanley. Plus, they would have to worry about the possibility of replacing their left tackle. So just the likelihood of a straight-up release is not high. However, a restructure for Ronnie Stanley, a restructure for maybe Marcus Williams, who has about a $19 million cap hit, and Patrick McCary, who has a $6.4 million cap hit, I think are certainly on the table.
Yeah, you got to do what you can to keep this Super Bowl window open, and at some point you got to pay the piper. Maybe there are certain situations where guys will agree to take pay cuts because either of their willingness to make this team more of a Super Bowl viable possibility, or because there was just this tacit understanding with the front office that, hey, an agent will acknowledge that my guy hasn't been especially available or especially productive. That would obviously be the case for both Marcus Williams and Ronnie Stanley. Marcus, as we talked to Kyle Hamilton yesterday, acknowledged that I think he showed a lot of folks a lot of courage, a lot of he won a lot of admiration in that locker room by playing through this pectoral injury. But that is 2 seasons in a row now where he has not been especially available. Ronnie Stanley, obviously not playing to the level of anywhere close to a Pro Bowl performer because of those knee and ankle injuries. So will there be any latitude there with his team? Ronnie loves being in Baltimore. He loves playing with Lamar. Would he be willing to restructure his contract to come back at a more team-friendly option? Maybe you make it up to him in the back end with options for, bonuses if he hits a certain amount of pass snaps, or, if he gets the Pro Bowl or All Pro, where he can make it up in the kind of ways that Odell had built into his contract for this year. But these guys are capitalists. They're going to try to make as much money as they can, and I don't think Ronnie Stanley would get anywhere close to the value of the contract elsewhere in Baltimore than if he came back. But these are the kind of tough decisions that the Ravens are going to have to make. Last year it was parting ways with Calais Campbell, and that seemed like a death knell for the Ravens interior pass rush at the time, because we didn't know that Justin Madubuike would turn into an All-Pro. But you trust in the development of this staff and this culture, and putting guys in positions to succeed, and just kind of letting the chips fall where they may.
Speaking of the staff, this Ravens coaching staff could get plundered a bit. Now, it seems like Todd Monken is here to stay, because the 2 jobs that he interviewed for, those positions have been filled. But Mike Macdonald, defensive coordinator, in high demand across the league. As more and more spots were being filled, it seemed more and more likely that he would come back. But as the Ravens approached the end of their season, 2 spots remained open, and those 2 spots are still open as of right now. That's the Washington Commanders and the Seattle Seahawks. He never interviewed with the Seahawks until, I believe, this morning is when he is, for the first time, meeting with Seahawks brass. He reportedly, according to Adam Schefter, was meeting with Commanders brass last night. So he is still a possibility, I think, for one of those 2 openings. What would be the potential fallout for losing Mike Macdonald, and how would the Ravens go about trying to replace him?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a guy who might be the best defensive coordinator in the NFL right now. Not just revered for his in-game adjustments and his game planning on a week-to-week basis, but really well respected in that locker room. Patrick Queen, a guy who did not have a lot of admiration for Wink Martindale. I think there was a lot of bad blood between those 2. Shout out Taylor Swift. And Mike Macdonald comes in, installs a defensive scheme, a defensive level of communication that can elevate a guy with as much physical ability and want to as Patrick Queen. And, PQ said that there's no better candidate out there. Obviously, I don't think Patrick Queen is going through the NFL.com list of guys who are interviewing, but there's a lot of love for a guy like Mike Macdonald. And obviously, if he leaves, then that means that maybe you can keep one of these other guys who is interviewing for defensive coordinator jobs elsewhere, and kind of keep things pretty stable by going in-house with a promotion there. But you lose someone like Mike Macdonald, that would be a tough blow, probably more significant than any potential free agents that they could lose this offseason.
And it's not just Mike Macdonald. Passing game coordinator and secondary coach Chris Hewitt interviewed for the Jaguars defensive coordinator position. Jannard Wilson, who's the defensive backs coach, has interviewed for defensive coordinator jobs with the Giants, Titans, and Rams, and now requested to interview with the Packers. Inside linebackers coach Zachary Orr, Packers requested to interview him for their defensive coordinator job. Wide receivers coach Greg Lewis interviewed with the Saints for their OC job. quarterbacks coach T. Martin, I haven't seen anything on him, but the work that he did with Lamar Jackson could certainly put him in position to get a job elsewhere. So it is not just Mike McDonald. It is a lot of the assistant coaches that don't draw as much attention on a week in and week out basis, but you lose some of your rank and file, coaches, and you could be seeing a regression across the board.
Yeah, and it is the also expectation that if Mike McDonald leaves, will he take any of these lower level staffers with him? Guys
Right.
that he's worked with, not just in this current tenure as Ravens defensive coordinator, but from when he was hanging around Baltimore before climbing the ranks under Wink Martindale. There is that trust level. I don't think it's an accident that the Chargers, when they hired Jim Harbaugh, wanted a guy who, for their offensive coordinator in Joe Hortiz, who has that experience with the Ravens and who has that experience with the Harbaugh family in general. Very rarely do you see coaches hire people that they're not familiar with. It is just one more thing to kind of not have to worry about. It's just like, you're not going to date someone that you, kind of just met on a blind date without actually getting to know them. It is it's an important consideration, that familiarity, that understanding that you and I are on the same wavelength as we put together our game plans, as we decide what we want for our team, for our culture, for our staff. So it is not just the possibility of the Ravens losing these assistant coaches and defensive coordinator to other spots. It is who else might they take with them and be willing to offer a raise to go and leave for these new spots.
You're not going to date somebody that just shows up at your concert and tries to meet you backstage, but can't get in because you're on vocal rest. Or wait, you will, because you're Taylor Swift and it's Travis Kelce. Had to make another Swift reference there, Jonas.
But by the way, I think the best tweet that I saw was like, we should also aspire to the level of fandom of Taylor Swift, which is to say you become a fan of a team in the year that they go to the Super Bowl.
Yeah. Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have Detroit Lions fans like that poor 92-year-old guy who they show on every single game, who's just been rooting desperately for just one breakthrough. And Taylor Swift gets Taylor Swift gets in 1 year what he could not in 5, 6, 7 decades.
Yeah, luck is not distributed evenly in this world, Jonas. All right, another question facing the Ravens this offseason is how is Eric DeCosta going to approach free agency in the draft? He's got some decisions to make even before free agency in terms of first-year options for 2025. So, he makes this decision this offseason. They'll have these guys under contract for the 2024 season, but it'll affect whether they're with the team beyond that season. So it's the 2 first-round picks from a few years ago. So Rashad Bateman and Odafe Oweh, $13.8 million cap hit for Rashad Bateman for the 2025 season and a $12.2 million cap hit for Odafe Oweh. I mean, at this point, we'll probably discuss it more as we get closer to that deadline. We saw the Ravens decline the option for Patrick Queen about a year ago and decide to move on from somebody who had been unproductive for the first couple of years, but had really turned it on in the second half of the 2023 season, or 2022 season, I should say. For me, I'm looking at this. I think Rashad Bateman is probably at this point, given the regression he has had with Lamar Jackson, probably a decline. And Odafe Oweh is on the fence, but probably you're picking that up. What would you do, Jonas?
It's tough because it is really hard to find like premier pass rushing talent that would be at a discount. And Odafe has not had the sack totals that that would be commensurate with a $12.2 million tab. But you look at the PFF grades, he's like 15th in pass rush win rate. I guess it just depends on how they feel about his trajectory. I mean, there were times this year when he looked unblockable, but if you feel like you can get him for about that rate over the long term, he is eligible for a contract extension this offseason, as is Rashad Bateman. Maybe you feel that is that's the safer approach. That's a smarter approach rather than taking on that fifth year option. I do agree that Odafe, in the matter of picking him up for 2025 is tougher than Rashad, even though I think Rashad's heights are still exceptionally high. And then there's just the matter of like, does Lamar Jackson's contract make these decisions that are on the fence even tougher to decide upon? I think the Tyler Linderbaum and Kyle Hamilton decisions next year are no-brainers because of just the surplus talent that they give you relative to those contracts. But with Adafe and Rashad, maybe those are cases where Lamar's contract and just how onerous it can become for these guys to make all these other decisions. It wouldn't surprise me if those are two no's from Eric for that 2021 class.
Yeah, and we saw Eric DeCosta and this Ravens front office be incredibly patient in free agency last year. They made that signing with Nelson Aguilar somewhat early. Then there was a whole lot of nothing. And then later in the offseason, that's when they started to dip their toes back into the free agency pool and get Rocky Yassin and Arthur Millette and Jadeveon Clowney, all very late in the process. And then in the draft, they're going to be connected with running backs, with offensive tackles, especially depending on what they do with Ronnie Stanley and Morgan Moses. Maybe wide receiver, defensive line, defensive backs. There are a lot of positions that I could see the Ravens going with, especially in the first round of the draft, because they're going to have a lot of positions to replace. And it's going to come down to who they lose in free agency. I think they're going to say throughout the process it's going to be best player available, but we all know that positional need has some weight in this conversation.
Yeah, and they probably should have 8 picks, I think is the latest expectation. They have 6 of their own. They should get a compensatory pick for losing Ben Powers last year. They have I think a 7th rounder for the Chuck Clark trade with the Jets a year ago. So that is not a bad stash of picks. It will be interesting to see what they might do, what they could do with those later round picks, because I think compared to like years past, that the depth of these draft classes will not be what they once were, because you have this trickle down effect from NIL, where these guys who might be late day 2, early day 3, mid day 3 picks are coming back to school. They're getting those big college boosters to stroke them a check for a couple $100,000 or $1 million and make it easier for them to stay in school and potentially improve their draft stock. So the areas where the Ravens once were better than the average NFL front office in finding value in those late rounds, it might be tough this year. You think back to the COVID draft where the Ravens ended up taking Ben Mason in like the 6th round or 7th round or whenever it was, and they took a freaking fullback over like kind of taking a flyer on offensive tackle, because there was just no one that they really trusted late in the rounds of that draft to potentially help that team down the road. So will they trade up in some of those spots? Will they trade down out of the first round because they don't see the value of getting a first round talent at that number 30 spot? There's a lot of really interesting kind of wrinkles to talk about with all this draft. I mean, they obviously need some guys to help Lamar in the immediate term, but also he's here for the long term too. So what kind of thinking will that, will that influence the thinking of Eric DeCosta as he plots out the course of this team and getting the most bang for your buck with the draft picks that they do have?
So those first 4 questions are really questions for the front office, for Eric DeCosta as he navigates the offseason. But Jonas, there's one big question I think we could say when it comes to the players and the coaches on the field. And that's, how will Lamar Jackson and Todd Monken evolve in their relationship? How will they get better after their first year together as quarterback and offensive coordinator? You mentioned in that article on the BaltimoreBanner.com that things got a little stale under Greg Roman, that Lamar did have an MVP season in his first year with Greg Roman, his first year as a starter, and things, wore out. Greg Roman eventually wore out his welcome in Baltimore. How do the Ravens avoid that? And quite frankly, how do they learn from the struggles that they had in the AFC Championship game and try to not make those same mistakes in big games in the future?
It's tough, because this is the first time with Lamar that he's moving forward in an offseason with a pass first offensive coordinator, if we can say that, a guy who has that experience of developing these big productive passing attacks. We don't know if T. Martin is going to be his QB's coach. If he is, it's definitely a good sign for building together. But there is always this need to evolve. The success of the Chiefs is going to create imitators next year in the same way that the success of the Titans and the AFC North teams who've kind of found a way to slow the Ravens rushing attack in 2020 and 2021 created imitators elsewhere around the NFL. So I think the Ravens have considerable talent at like the key spots on offense to do what they need to. Obviously, the running back position is a bit of a question mark right now, but I think you can find good production for that spot on the cheap. But if you're talking about Lamar having Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, who is still getting open, Mark Andrews, who is a Pro Bowler perennially, Isaiah Likely, who was one of the most valuable tight ends in football, just on a per target basis. That's a really nice foundation to build around. Justice Hill, one heck of a secondary running back to, especially on those obvious passing downs. So I think the Ravens have a lot more. They're in a much better spot now, talent wise, than they were compared to 2020. I think coordinator wise, scheme wise, having Todd Monken is definitely an advantage over Greg Roman. But it's on Lamar and Todd and John Harbaugh and everyone in that coaching room to find a way to move past this year and, if not get to MVP levels every time, at least maybe put this offense in more sustainable spots when that first read isn't there, that second read is there. What can you do to kind of help things out?
Yeah. So those are the biggest questions facing the Ravens this offseason. One more thing I do want to get to, a bit of news from yesterday. From one Harbaugh to another, that's where Joe Hortiz is going. You mentioned it, the fact that the Ravens director of player personnel since 2019 is going to the Chargers, just like Mike McDonald went from Jim Harbaugh to John Harbaugh. He went from John to Jim to John. Now Joe Hortiz is going from John to Jim. Maybe eventually he'll make his way back to John, but he is going to be the general manager out in L.A. Certainly a loss in terms of the front office depth, and now potentially a spot that the Ravens will have to replace. Do you think this is a move that they'll look to make before the draft, or they'll just kind of hold off until things settle down the offseason?
Yeah, I think usually you want to get things settled before the draft. You want to have that clear hierarchy on draft day. It has always been Eric DeCosta, John Harbaugh, and Joe Hortiz kind of sitting at that draft table for the past couple of years, ever since I've covered the team. So you want that lieutenant out there with you on draft night and throughout the whole process. So I imagine the Ravens will move quickly to maybe promote from within to figure out exactly how that power structure, that new power structure looks. But it's definitely a loss. Joe Hortiz has been here in Baltimore forever, since '98. Coming up the ranks as a scout, having those relationships on the East Coast. Former Northeast scout, former Mid-Atlantic scout in the South. Obviously, an Auburn graduate, so he has those ties to a lot of big time programs. But that these are the kind of situations you have to deal with. The Ravens maybe dodged a bullet when the Giants didn't hire him a couple of years ago. So the Ravens, had those extra 2 years with him that maybe they in another situation would not have. But with Eric DeCosta and Ozzie Newsome, you have that stability, you have that knowledge, you have that reliability to draw from. So you just hope that someone there is that next Joe Hortiz in the waiting in the wings there, ready for his come up. And it's just a matter of whether the Ravens trust him or her enough to fill those big shoes.
And I think we'll find out more when we eventually hear from Eric DeCosta. We'll eventually hear from John Harbaugh. Time TBD, because it could be a while before we hear from them as they wait to get their coaching staff figured out. But when they do talk, we will be here on the Banner Ravens podcast. I think if they don't talk in the next week, we should plan to do a Tuesday podcast at 11 a.m. and we can be back for you here, as we'll be here with you throughout the entire offseason on the Banner Ravens podcast. Jonas is at Jonas_Shaffer on Twitter. I am at Paul Mancano and at All Banner Sports as well. Please like, review, rate, subscribe. Give us a positive review. If you give us a good review, we'll read it out here on the podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will be back at some point soon. If Mike McDonald gets a head coaching gig, I think we just might have to go live with a breaking news emergency podcast. So we will be close by our microphones throughout this entire offseason. For Jonas Shaffer, I'm Paul